Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Bhaskar Sunkara, and I'm the editor and publisher of Jacobin. And I was very honored when Alicia and Russell asked me to take part in this series honoring Michael's work. It does still feel weird to talk about Michael this way, or to admit that he isn't here with us in the physical form, at least. I still have the urge to call him or text him, but like a lot of you, I imagine lately, I've been thinking about his work and what he was trying to accomplish and why. And I could talk a lot about Michael the human being and Michael the friend, but he was a savvy and serious and profoundly political person, or at least that was a major part of his life. And connecting people and ideas and bringing together an audience for a very particular purpose. It was all about one thing. It was all about improving the life of the downtrodden, improving the lives of people who were working every day to try to survive in a country that was often, very cruel and mercurial with their lives. And I think his work, and I think this channel did something to help, in a small way, break the spell of capitalist realism, offer us a vision of a better future. And we're still fighting that fight, and things might not look as promising in many ways than it did maybe a year ago today, but it certainly looks better than it did 5 years ago. And over the course of this 5 years, obviously electoral politics, I think, certainly became a lot more important for my worldview. I'm sure the same was the case for Michael or for a lot of our panelists this evening. I think it went for a lot of people on the left from an afterthought or something of a culmination of a long period of slow and steady organizing to something that was immediately important and viable. So today, that's our topic, electoral politics. It's really broad, but we have a wonderful panel with us, and I'll introduce them one by one. I guess first up, we have Bill Fletcher Jr. Bill is a racial justice, labor, and international activist. He's the author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions, many other books, including a great work of fiction he recently put out. He's also the co-author of a book, Solidarity Divided, that was very important for a bunch of us when we were in the Young Democratic Socialists. I believe Bill came and spoke to a gathering of us in, I want to say 2007, 2008, one of those winter conferences, and I was happy to take part in that. So the first time I'm not even sure I told him this, but the first time I heard Bill speak was then, around 13 years ago. And we're obviously still occasionally collaborating in Jacobin and other places. So I'm pleased to be here with Bill. We also have Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna, I think, needs no introduction because you probably know her from being the former National Press Secretary for the Bernie 2020 campaign. She is the co-host of Bad Faith Pod and a contributing editor at Current Affairs, and formerly was at The Intercept. And then we have finally Matt Karp, who's a contributing editor of Jacobin. He's a professor of history at Princeton, and he is the author of This Vast Southern Empire, a great book that explains a lot about U.S. statecraft and the years before the Civil War. So thank you all for joining us. I think one question that's been asked at the beginning of these memorial shows has been for people to just say a couple words about Michael's life and legacy, about your connection with Michael. So I just wanted to open the floor with that before we get into the meat of the conversation. So Bill, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Excuse me. Sure, Bhaskar. And thanks for this. It's funny. I don't remember when I first met him. But I'll tell you the thing I always enjoyed when Michael would ask me to be on one of his programs. And in large part because he was very smart and asked very good questions and was able on a regular basis to, I mean, it was a discussion. It was a discussion of substance. And this was, it was something that I enjoyed. And I couldn't believe when word, I couldn't believe when word came through that he had passed away. I wasn't ready for it at all. And I feel like I've been saying this again and again because just different people dying. I regretted not having a chance to say goodbye. Because, you know, there's some people you don't just simply want to say goodbye, you want to say thank you. Thank you for being who you were. Thank you for being a comrade, for being a friend. And when you aren't able to do that, it's just like something is missing.
Yeah, I think I had much the same feeling. You know, one of my actually bizarre thing that I did. Sorry for this aside, but in May, I was back in New York City for a few days before in the middle of the pandemic. And for some reason, I was walking down in Brooklyn, down Green Avenue towards my apartment, which at the time was at Quincy and Classen. So if you know Brooklyn geography, you knew that I could either walk down Green or walk down Gates. And for some reason, I decided, let me walk down Gates because maybe I'll run into Michael because I'll pass his house that way. And I did. I ran into him. We chatted. It was the last time I saw him. We chatted for a bit on his stoop. And yeah, I don't know what compelled me to do that. Obviously it wasn't the same as saying goodbye, but I've been thinking about that moment, and that's given me some solace, that little serendipitous meeting. I guess, Briahna, do you want to go next with that?
Sure. I consider myself, I guess I have to stop saying this, but relatively new to politics and certainly to engaging in kind of the left community that I now find to be very familiar. And Michael was quite literally my entry point into it, or, you know, my second real entry point into it after I was first kind of brought into the current affairs family and was able to publish for the first time. And Michael invited me on a show to talk about the first article I ever wrote, which was about the weaponization of identity politics. And I remember being so nervous because I'd never, gone on any kind of been in any kind of media context talking about an original idea in that way. And I didn't know what kind of situation was going to be or what kind of personality he was going to be, whether it was going to be combative or a friendly interview. And I remember him being enormously warm and putting me at ease. And to echo a point earlier made, really obviously interested substantively in the conversation. He had, every interview is not like this. They don't always really read what you've written and really think about the questions you raised and press on you in a way that brings out your best. But Michael was like that. And he invited me back continuously, fairly regularly. And as other kind of opportunities emerged for me, he was a sounding board and was always so supportive. And in a space that can sometimes feel competitive and somewhat ego-driven, he was never that way, which is a special feat given that he, like myself, was a Leo. So, with everything that's happened this year, it really is, if there was anybody that I would have wanted to bounce things off of and get a temperature read on, and, if I want to have a gut check to know if I'm thinking about something the right way, or at least want someone who is arguing in good faith to complicate the way I'm thinking about something, I would want it to be Michael. And, he's missed, I feel like, this year in this moment more than any time I could imagine. And I feel like I have the opposite story, Bhaskar, of our last meeting, which is that we were supposed to meet up for this joint podcast, three-way, Michael, The Dig, and the Bernie podcast, because the campaign was ongoing in February. And I missed my connection coming back from the South Carolina election day and ended up staying in DC. And I was so chagrined because I really wanted to do it. And it was going to be in Boston. And it's like my home turf in a lot of ways because I went to school there. And I I was really upset about it, but I didn't think it would be the last time that I had an opportunity to see him. So I'm glad you were able to have that one last run in, but he's deeply missed.
Matt?
Yeah, it's funny. Love what you guys said, Bill and Briahna. I actually do remember the first time I met Michael in the flesh. Bhaskar was there. I don't think I've told this story, but like, it's not that good of a story. I sort of knew of Michael as like a vague Twitter presence this must have been 2-3 years ago, 3-4 years ago, maybe. He was associated with the Majority Report, maybe something, I liked his feed, but I didn't know about his show. I didn't know about, really his worldview. And I was sitting with some of the guys, Jacobin guys, Bhaskar and some other people at a bar somewhere in Brooklyn. It's another street. Where was it?
I think it was at Hotburg. That's no longer.
Was it? I don't think it was. Anyway, we'll leave that one to the archivist. And yeah, I was sitting there with his friend Asher, who worked at Verso, and he was like, is that Michael? Did Michael Brooks just walk by? And I was like, what? I was like, oh yeah, Michael Brooks, that guy from online. He was like, that guy. And Asher was like, that guy is funny as fuck. He was like, that guy is funny as hell. He's the funniest guy. I mean, we were sitting there all talking politics the whole time. We weren't even being that funny. And he just comes out full stop. I was like, oh, I know Michael. He's he's like a left liberal political take guy, whatever. And Ash was just like, no, he is the funniest guy. He is just funny, just pure funny. And I was like, what? It's like, he's hilarious. That guy's hilarious. Anyway, he walked down the street. He didn't see us, I think, at first. And he did whatever he was doing. I think he was going to the corner store or something. He's walking back. This time we're like, hey, Michael. Like, I think Bhaskar knew him a little bit at that point. They went on to become much better friends. But and Asher knew him, and he came over, and he probably did like 10 minutes with us, and we were just cracking up the whole time. It was just, it's like you could bring in Eddie Murphy and he came in and just give you 10 minutes. And it was just like, then he was gone. He had to go do what he was doing. And I was like, that guy is funny as fuck. And anyway, so that was my introduction to Michael's just like superhuman power in that vein, where he was just so, especially in a conversation, as funny as he was online. And I hate to be like, oh, I know the real Michael, but some people are just funnier, when you're in a small group, back and forth, and I know people mistrust this. People said Hillary Clinton was a really great politician in a small group. You wouldn't know if you weren't in the room, but I didn't know Michael that well. I only, hung out with him a handful of times, frankly, but his energy in the room was amazing. Of course, his political legacy is much more important, and it went far beyond humor. And his that earthy sensibility that everyone talks about, combined with his kind of intense moral seriousness, it's just such a rare combination to kind of have that that you never doubted Michael's ethics and his morality, and somehow that opened up so much space for his totally wild sense of humor that that was transgressive, even as you knew he was so morally centered. It's a very strange and rare amalgam. I don't know too many people who have it, even beyond his intellectual capacity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that was what was so powerful about him, or one of the things. He was a 5-tool player, so he had a lot of things he was powerful at. A lot of powers. Okay, but I'll stop there because I could just babble, and we should talk substance.
The sports metaphor is always like also my cue when people tell me to stop. I'm comparing like political figures to like G League prospects, but I do the same thing. So yeah, it's such a big topic, and I figure we should have a pretty free-flowing conversation. But I just wanted to start with a couple like undergirding questions, and I guess one would be. Any of you can start with this, but maybe Briahna, you wanna, if you want to go first. I'm wondering what we think the Bernie coalition is after Bernie, like whether it's a discernible thing. It's a very big question, so if you want to pass and have someone take it first, I promised everyone I would send questions ahead of time, but I did not. So that's the first big question. When we talk about Bernieism and the Bernie coalition, after the campaign, are we actually talking about something coherent, or are we talking about the idea of something? Because I'm not even sure myself.
I think it's very much coherent. One of the things I used to brag about on the campaign is that if you asked a Bernie supporter why they supported Bernie, they very clearly articulated one of a number of policy concerns that Bernie uniquely championed among a very big field, and that they knew a lot about because they had been affected by them deeply. Usually healthcare was right at the top. Student debt, I mean, everybody knows the list. And you could go to a Bernie rally, and if you got into random conversations with folks, which you were likely to do, that's actually the last time I saw Michael was at that October Bernie's Back rally in New York. They're going to tell you their story, and it's going to be compelling, and you know that they're in it because it's deeply personal and those issues aren't going anywhere. So we were people who were brought together not by a personality as much by deeply shared interests. And those interests and those concerns have only gotten deeper in the context of a global pandemic where 14 million Americans have just been kicked off of their employer-based health insurance. 300,000 people have died. And, you know, 88% of Democrats actually support the damn thing. So I guess the question is less, I think, whether the coalition exists. And not to mention, you know, there's these class dynamics of the coalition, right? Where Bernie had the most working class coalition. And not all that ties into the idea that these are people who have needs that they're looking to be met. So there might be a question about whether or not the movement needs a new figurehead, someone who can quell some of the infighting and the panic that I think has arisen from this idea that there is no one who's clearly at the helm right now. There's a lot of ambivalence among potential leaders about wanting to step in to those shoes. A lot of skepticism about anyone who would want to be a leader of movements that we sometimes, you know, romanticize as being leaderless. And that's a tough question, the kind of what comes next question. And I wish, again, that's a question I think that Michael would be very good at helping us to answer because he did foreground solidarity in such an important way. That's ultimately what's lacking. Someone to make us prioritize those shared interests above the differences that, of course, exist in a, you know, diverse, pluralistic society. But I have plenty of confidence about the ability to corral us all, no matter what my Twitter timeline suggests. Like I am absolutely confident. I wish sometimes that we had more confidence in ourselves and our ideas, because it wasn't that Bernie Sanders was some amazing orator that got him into this position and pulled him from nowhere and being a senator with single digit name recognition to winning 44% of the vote in 2016. It was because he said things like healthcare is a human right, which, as obvious and basic as that is galvanizing and transformative in a country where we can't even conceive of the idea of walking into the hospital and being able to get cancer treatment if you don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank. And it is still the case that healthcare is a human right. It is still the case that housing is a human right. He's empowered millions of people to say those kinds of things out loud without feeling like they're being squishy granola weirdos from, you know, Washington State. You know, no offense, it's a great state. And I think there's a lot of potential in that. We just, you know, I think it's fine to have a little bit of disorganization and a bit of a mourning period, but the crisis, I think, is ultimately going to be a lightning rod for us, and I'm looking forward to where we go next.
Bill, do you want to jump in, or anyone could just jump in too whenever, you know, you want.
I appreciate it. I'm not a sanguine. I'm not convinced at all that the coalition still exists. I'm a veteran or refugee, whatever you want to call it, of the Jackson campaign of '88. And I remember all too well that after doing a phenomenal job, Jackson made the mistake of assuming that a Jackson wing of the Democratic Party had emerged. And it hadn't. A large amount of sympathy and sentiment in favor of Jackson emerged and played a very important role. But there was no real Jackson wing. I think that Bernie did a fabulous job, and I think has laid the foundation for something. That the question we have to debate is, what is that something? And I think that if it is, in effect, what we've seen too often with progressives, let's wait 4 years for the next presidential election, then this will have been a waste. On the other hand, if it is, let's start thinking right now about the midterm elections. Let's start thinking now about how do we take power in different states, what kind of organizations we need to put into place. Then I think that will have been the proper building off of the Sanders effort.
I like this role. I get to be just not too big, not too small, just right. I'll somewhere in the middle between optimism and skepticism here, because in a funny way, Bill, what you said actually made me more optimistic than I had been. When the comparison to Jesse Jackson's run, which is obviously 2 presidential campaigns, powerful impact on the race, ideologically huge challenge to the establishment, and then you get Bill Clinton, and what happens next? It's a daunting precedent. But I think just based on the criteria that you laid out, to me, there are more reasons for optimism than there were, say, in 1988 or 1989. If you think about, just right here in New York State, the, fresh crop of DSA legislators who've arrived, who are, I think pretty ideologically committed to some version of the Bernie project. Now, there is a lot of debate, as Briahna says, in between what the Bernie project means, and maybe we'll get to that. But I think all of them, the several state legislators who are elected, would identify with that. And I think you see that it's just the earliest sprout of this happening in terms of electeds at the state level and elsewhere. But I think the coherence and the determination to Bill's point, to win power as a kind of as a Sanders wing or as a sort of socialist wing of the Democratic Party does exist in a number of places. So that is a reason for optimism. There's a couple data points. Seth Maskett, liberal, wrote a book about what the Democrats learning from loss from 2016 to 2020. Jared Abbott sent me this. Bernie donors, which we all know a lot about Bernie donors, how important they were, these small donors, Walmart employees, teachers, nurses, everywhere, remarkably consistent from 2016 to 2020. These are the same, it's an enduring group of people, remarkably consistent too in donating to state and local candidates, across the country under the aegis of Our Revolution, Justice Democrats, etc. There's a group that wants to do this, as Briahna says, that is galvanized by Bernie's ideas. I think it is somewhat coherent, and I love your Briahna. I love your confidence about just if we just rally it, it will come. I think that for me, the note of caution is it big enough, and how do we get it bigger? Because right now, Bernie 2020 wasn't enough. We needed more votes. We needed more people, and we needed more working class people. We needed more people, period. And the challenge is, I do think it will endure, but this is where the political scientist Maskett comes out, and I don't think he's an ideological comrade of ours. But I think his point is a challenge to us. He says Sanders' coalition will endure, but it won't grow, and that's a challenge for us. I feel okay about it enduring, but I think we need to think about how to grow it.
Yeah, I feel sometimes as though there is a lot of purchase and a certain kind of cynicism on the left in particular. And it is sometimes described as doomerism. And it is very popular and can often be cathartic. And I certainly do engage in it in my own kind of private sphere plenty. I have as much reason as anyone to have been very disappointed by how this year went. However, I don't really see it as constructive. Like if right now I knew that there was, some magical exogenous force that came down and made it 10 times harder for us to win next, 2 years from now, 4 years from now than it was this year, I would still sit here and say, we absolutely can win because we don't have an alternative. There's no option to not do everything in your conceivable power to try to win. And telling people that I'm not telling anyone it's going to be easy. My optimism isn't naivete. It's an understanding that to rally more people and to grow a movement, people need to feel like there's something to be won and that they're not consigned to be among a rank of losers for all time. And that was something that Bernie had that other folks didn't. There was this glimmer in people's eyes that said, oh God, he came close. And now that he's lost a second time, there are a whole lot of people that want to make the argument that this is proof that the revolution isn't possible. Oh, revolution, they scoff and roll their eyes. And I won't, give an inch to that kind of rhetoric. And if I have to be bombastic and seem naive or overly sanguine in my approach, I'll do it, because I don't see very many people with me over here making that kind of an effort, to focus on the possible, and do the rallying along with all of the intellectual work that needs to be done, all of the organizing work that needs to be done. And that's part of what I listened to Michael Brooks's show. I did feel like things were in the realm of the possible. When he talked about historical precedent and did those deep dives, it was helpful to me because it made me understand we have been up against this or bigger issues in the past, and this is how people work themselves out of it. It enables you to get out of like that doomer mindset.
So Bhaskar, I just have to intervene here, just because I don't want to be painted in this doomer thing. I don't know whether you were directing that at me, Briahna.
It's a general.
No. Let me finish.
I doubt she was thinking about you, Bill. I think she's thinking about the online people I know.
There's a lot going on.
No, that's fine.
Now,
I just want to be clear. I want to be very clear that I am actually quite optimistic, but I answer the question that you were posing, Bhaskar. I think what I'm focused on are issues of strategy. That's what I'm focused on. And I am really frustrated with what happens with the left, where we basically wait around every 4 years for a presidential campaign, very reluctantly jumping in or looking for a messiah, and don't put in the work in our different states in building organization and building the kind of fronts that we need in order to win power. If we're not interested in winning power, I'm not interested. That discussion no longer involves me. If we are interested in power, then that's the discussion we need to have. So I think that the Bernie campaign absolutely inspired a lot of people, had a lot of problems, but certainly inspired a lot of people. The question we got to figure out now is organizationally, where do we take this?
So I think that it's worth noting, first of all, that the Democratic Socialists of America approaching 100,000 members is a relatively new and unprecedented thing. It is causing a lot of ripple effects down ballot. We're seeing that in New York, we're seeing it in Chicago, we're seeing it elsewhere in the country. I guess the question that I have in part is a definitional question, which is, like, what is a Bernie-crat candidate? I think we know what a Bernie-crat supporter is, that it's still out there. But when I think of, let's say if we define it just along policy lines of willing to support a Green New Deal, willing to support Medicare for all, willing to support certain other measures like a $15 minimum wage, this kind of broadly economically populist agenda of Bernie, then there's a lot of politicians and there's a large swath of, let's say, activists who fit that criteria. But that also includes like a lot of Warren supporters and a lot of people who are closer to the establishment of the Democratic Party, which brings me to like Bernie. I think one distinguishing factor was the clarity of his rhetoric, how broad it was and how it was able to resonate with people who aren't in existing either activist milieus or aren't that engaged in politics, but also a confrontational style, willing to talk about powerful corporations and interests and the need to fight them to make any progress. The way that Warren somewhat wavered on, at least as it relates to the Democratic Party, as opposed to the corporation side. And I think that's where I think that despite the popularity of our message in an institutional sense, we're extremely weak, and the lines are in the future possibly going to be less defined between even like a Presley and a Ilhan Omar, where I in fact think they approach things in quite different ways. So again, directed to basically no one and everyone at the same time. So if someone wants to bail me out and jump in, it would be much appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bhaskar, I think you're on the mark, because that's both an invitation and a challenge. I mean, because on the one hand, as I was saying, we need to grow this movement both electorally and institutionally. So on the one hand, the blurring of the boundaries between, say, we can't run the 2020 primary over and over and over again ad infinitum and sort of just stay locked in with the 27 to 37% of the vote that Bernie got. We don't want that. Nobody wants that. We want to expand that number electorally, and we want to expand it institutionally. We want to bring people to us. But at the same time, we definitely don't want our people to go to them. And we don't want, and so the blurring of these lines is dangerous if Bernieism gets subsumed into just the Congressional Progressive Caucus and it's kind of ongoing existence as a sort of perkier wing of the Democratic Party, which is not what I think any of us on this call are interested in. And certainly it wasn't what Michael was interested in. And I think you're right to point to both opportunity in this blurring and risk that we lose that confrontational aspect. We lose what defined the Bernie movement, not just in terms of his supporters, but the political energy behind Bernieism was its willingness to attack bipartisan, to some extent, the bipartisan, responsibility for, our grotesque second Gilded Age. And, the reality that 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And meanwhile, the billionaires are piling up their wealth in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, it's outrageous, the daily outrages of our society. And I don't need to get on my soapbox with you guys, far from it. But we need, what Bernie offered was someone who was willing to sort of point the finger in a populist way at the larger political establishment and the political class and its measure of responsibility for that. And that window is hard without Bernie, because the only avenue forward is competing within the Democratic Party electorally. And Democratic Party voters, we learned, and Democratic Party, electeds respond to sort of partisan logics, where what's most important to sort of move ahead in that context is bashing the Republicans and putting everything on them and being a team player to some extent with the Democrats. And obviously we see a version of this, and I'll wrap up here, but we see a version of this in the recent arguments, the kerfuffle about AOC and the Medicare for All vote. I actually thought Briahna's piece on this was terrific, but it's just divided a lot of left-wing opinion about how confrontational we should be in order to sort of maintain, grow the party, that is the party of the left, grow the Bernie movement, but at the same time not be subsumed within a kind of toothless progressivism.
Yeah, I think Briahna, I definitely want you to talk a little bit about your piece and some of those underlying debates. It was in Current Affairs, I think about maybe a week ago or a few days ago, the case for forcing a floor vote on Medicare for all. And I think in particular, the dilemma that I see you trying to do, a lot of us at Jacobin trying to do as well, which is, we are anti-establishment. We want to be very critical of the Democratic Party, but at the same time, we're in favor of running primary challenges within a Democratic Party in which the primary process is populated by loyal Democrats. So sometimes the rhetoric that we want to pursue isn't totally the rhetoric of those primaries. Like I know my parents were Bernie #1 voters, but very happy Biden #2 voters. Like they basically liked all the candidates, which just does not exist among young people, at least, not just on offline or online, but really is a real constituency in the Democratic Party.
By my mom, we're in a Bernie #1, Green Party #2 kind of household. So I extend to you my sympathies. So this is the question. Rhetorically, I would like to just point out, we went through this whole cycle during the campaign where Bernie said the establishment, and the corporate media collectively decided that establishment was synonymous with Black people, which was a real fun little merry-go-round to do right there for a hot second. And so, they're gonna pivot and mess with your definitions, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to be as careful as we can be going into it. So, for instance, I try to be very careful online when I talk about the Democrats that I'm antagonistic to, the Democratic Party, to say corporate Democrat. It's a little clumsy sometimes. It took some getting used to, but corporate, I think, is a lot harder to spin than establishment. Although I don't think, I think most people understand what the establishment means. That was more of a corporate figment, corporate media figment. But to the deeper question, yeah, I have had a long talks about what to do about Elizabeth Warren voters and how this was an issue during the campaign too, right? How to make it clear that there are meaningful distinctions between these candidates without being painted as someone who's just randomly and unfairly attacking this very nice lady, right? If I tweet, well, Elizabeth Warren doesn't actually want to cancel all your student debt. She only wants to cancel $50,000 of it. That's a hate crime in some circles. And there are always going to be some bad faith actors. But I think one principal issue is that we have to decouple ourselves from our reliance on the corporate media. And that's part of what the stunt is about, right? It's an acknowledgement that Bernie and the movement has done its job to a great extent. 88% of Democrats support Medicare for all. Almost 50% of Republicans support Medicare for all. This isn't a popularity issue. Obviously, we're in this context where so many people have died from COVID. So many people have been kicked off their insurance. People have never cared about this issue more. In any sane world, the media would be drawing the contradiction between what our elected officials are willing to fight for and what their constituents want. And they would point to the fact that our elected officials are, many of them, taking enormous sums of money from the very industries that want to maintain the private health insurance industry, right? And that Joe Biden took more money from that industry than any other candidate. And Jim Clyburn, who was arguably responsible for resuscitating his campaign, bringing it back from the dead, takes more money from those industries than anybody in the whole of Congress, right? And that information gap would be closed, and that would have an effect on people's voting patterns. But we don't have that, and the media is never going to do it, and we can't rely on it. So how do you get past that? How do you force people to pay attention to that gap, which is, I think, largely driving the failure of people to come out for Bernie in the way that we wanted them to? Or something like 30% of Biden voters actually thought he supported Medicare for all. How do you get around that? And that's going to take some creativity. That's going to take some stunts. That might require forcing a vote on Medicare for all on the floor, accompanied with investment from movement actors who will set up a tent city outside of the Capitol and have a line of little boys and girls with diabetes who can't afford their medication. A GoFundMe march where a bunch of people who are only surviving on the money that they're able to earn on GoFundMe to pay for their health care, to force the media to pay attention, draw sympathetic cases forward, create a platform for these folks, use the platforms we have in these kind of stars that we have managed to get elected. The squad, obviously. You know, we talk about being coastal elites on the left, but we never really leverage the platforms of some of these, frankly, celebrities who are down for Bernie and willing to spread the message. None of the creativity that you would expect to come out of kind of a left coastal movement, you know, the whole of California went for Bernie, are really being deployed, I think, creatively in this moment, because I think there's a part of us that doesn't really think it's going to work, or is so concerned about the potential backlash that we aren't willing to try anything, even though we're so, frankly, disempowered, that the risk reward militates heavily toward just giving it a shot. So that's where I am right now.
So I want to go to Bill on one question. So Bill, obviously the broad overarching part of this conversation is about electoral politics. That's our broad prompt. But it seems to me that often we jump to talking about electoral politics in terms of winning elections, as opposed to, I think, the construction of a popular democratic bloc that could, hold power. And obviously it's the same thing. So, but I know a lot of your work has been thinking about this longer term project of building left institutional power, and in particular, the role that the labor movement can play. And obviously that's where you spent the bulk of your time as an activist and organizer. So I'm wondering if you could just bring in the dimension of organized labor into this conversation.
Well, there's a lot there, Bhaskar. So let me just start with first going back to your earlier question. I think that we have to keep in mind Bernie ran a campaign. He didn't set up an organization. And it was a movement. It was not a political party. And I say that because what that means that we have to force ourselves to accept is that there were a lot of people engaged who had a variety of different reasons why they were engaged in a campaign. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. So that the movement itself was going to be very diverse. And it was going to be very hard under the best of circumstances that the movement itself would come out overly coherent, precisely because of the nature of movements. And so that then takes us into this question of organization and why organization becomes very important. Because what we do need to be figuring out, I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, I was in Texas. I gave a speech, and people were telling me about how bad the situation was in Texas. So I'm listening. And so then they turned to me and I said, how do we take over Texas? And they were like stunned by the question, right? They thought I was crazy. And I said, no, really, what do we need to put into place in order to take over Texas? What are the key social movements? What are the cities, key opinion makers, et cetera? What counties do we need? I said, these are the questions that we need to be answering. If we're thinking about building a bloc that not only can win, but can govern, those are the questions that we've got to be figuring out. So it goes in some ways to Matt's point that the Bernie supporters are a jumping off point, but they're not an end point. We've got to build something that's much broader. Now, many of us on the left are really scared of that because when you go broader, it gets messy. You can't be pure. There's compromises that have to be made. But that's one of the reasons that we on the left have to be very clear about what it is that we're fighting for and articulate a vision that really is compelling, that can win over some more of these forces that are in the middle that are going to be interested in winning and governing. And if we don't, we remain a sect. That's the problem. And one of the things with the middle, which I've noticed over time, the middle can often be very, what's a good word for it? Very unforgiving of the left and very forgiving of the right. The right can be corrupt and decadent, and people in the middle will figure out ways of making excuses. The left screws up once and the middle is often ready to jump. And so we've got to be paying attention to how it is that we build these kind of alliances. And labor has a role in that, although, and this would be for a longer discussion, Bhaskar, organized labor right now is incredibly fragmented. And there is not one set of politics coming out of labor, and is certainly not a majority view of what I'd call social justice unionism.
So just briefly before we move on, I actually think this is an important term that we used to discuss a lot on the left, or at least in part, Solidarity Divided and some other work around that time brought that phrase more into circulation. But can you give us a brief definition of social justice unionism? What do you mean by that?
So for most of the 20th century, unionism was dominated by the thinking of founder of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, which was what was called pure and simple unionism, bread and butter unionism. And the idea was that the union existed to fight for wages, hours, and working conditions for the people who happened to be lucky enough to be in unions. Social justice unionism is contained in the practice of much of the left of what became the Congress of Industrial Organizations and some others, which was looking at a sort of transformative process, a process that was addressing the worker, not simply in the workplace and not simply at the level of wages, hours, and working conditions, but looking at the worker as a 24-hour being. So looking at the conditions in the communities, issues of housing and healthcare, and what does the union as a movement and organization have to do or say about that? And how can the union participate with other social justice organizations in shifting the balance of political power?
So, sorry, I think that's a great definition. Once again, I keep plugging it, but I really do recommend people should get a copy of Solidarity Divided. Also, Bill's other work too, but that in particular, I think, is the book for this moment, whether you're in the union movement or not. So I do have one kind of follow-up question for all of you. So Briahna, if you want to jump in, but everyone else too. On the actual composition of the Democratic Party itself. So obviously, we've heard a lot. It's all just hot air, obviously, from Republicans following this election, Marco Rubio calling the Republican Party the new Workers' Party. But it is undeniable that both Trump did make some gains among the 7 million plus votes or so he gained among Black and Latino working class people, among kind of other demographics that he previously did worse at. He's still doing pretty badly among these demographics. We shouldn't overstate it, but he did seem to win over some more workers in some parts of the country, and he also, at the same time, Biden's base and the base of the Democratic Party seemed to get even more disproportionately educated relative to the rest of the country in terms of formal education, disproportionately wealthier, better in suburbs and whatever else. So I guess, is there something that can be done to change the composition of the Democratic Party? And I kind of feel like we're in a tough position if we feel like we're trapped by this two-party system, at least in the short and medium term. But our vehicle for social democracy, or at least some social democratic reforms, seem to be dependent on the votes of people who don't always seem to want social democracy. And obviously, there's a much bigger base of working class people who are not often voting or who aren't currently activated or engaged. But what do we, I guess this is just a general question about reflecting on potentially the growth of professional and wealthier people within the Democratic Party.
My experience talking on the campaign trail and as a reporter on the campaign trail to your Midwestern, rural, white, diner voter, whoever ends up in those New York Times profiles about Trump voters, is that I am much more confident about my ability to flip them to Bernie than I am someone from my old law firm. By a mile. There's just no contest. Because the person you meet on the road, you have casual conversation and you smile a little bit and you ask them about their life or the kid that's next to them or their grandma or whatever. And then you ask them what concerns them. And they have concerns because everybody does. And you say, oh, that's too bad. And then you say, well, do you know how ex-Republican is responsible for that kind of thing? And I'm really sorry for you. You know, there's some people who think that this might help. Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah. Someone like Bernie Sanders. I'm actually here to cover a Bernie rally. Have you heard of him? Yeah, I mean, maybe. Was he a Democrat? No, he's not. He's an independent. It's a real bonus, that one. And you end up getting through to people. And I'm not going to overstate that. Obviously, there's plenty of people in MAGA hats who want to be extra. But you know, you said something along the lines of, you know, people who are less receptive to social democracy. My experience is not that those people are less receptive to social democracy. It's that we have two corporate parties, both doing a lot of terrible things. I'm not going to say that they're exactly the same or equivalent, but they are largely perceived as two corporate parties. But the Republicans are much better at messaging. And they're much better at laying the blame at Democrats' feet. And they're much better at singing the praises for the things that they do accomplish or spinning what they do as accomplishments that are inuring to the benefit of people. And I am not entirely sure structurally why that is. Even on things that like corporate Democrats agree on, they seem to not be able to get on TV and use the same messaging points with the kind of consistency that can enable them to win battles. But my concern is that the right is, you know, very comfortable with embracing a faux populism. And populism works in the same way that I explained flipping a Trump voter to Bernie on the campaign trail it works when the Tucker Carlsons of the world embrace that kind of rhetoric. It resonates with people because it's true. They're doing it cynically, but it works and it's true. And, it doesn't, the how isn't as mysterious to me as the how are you, the how to flip people isn't as mysterious to me as how you get Democrats to embrace it, because their interests are so rooted in not doing it, not giving any oxygen to what could become a genuine populist movement, or setting the expectations of Democratic voters so they can't be pressed down into believing that they should be living paycheck to paycheck the way that most people do.
Yeah, well, I think when I met workers not that receptive, people not receptive to social democracy, I meant more some of the wealthier voters who have changed the composition of the Democratic Party. In a sense, Bernie was competing with a field, a group of, in a field where Biden was getting votes from people who previously would have been voting in a Republican primary had this election happen, 8 years.
Well, that's the thing. The Lincoln Project was such a colossal failure. They spent $70 million on these ads, and more registered Republicans voted for Trump this time around than they did in 2016.
Yeah, I guess.
So,
in this, oh yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to run in a minute, so I just wanted to put this in. I think we have to be very careful. There's the Republican Party, beginning with Nixon, positioned itself to be the non-Black party. And so when I hear, like when Trump described the Republican Party as being a workers' party, what he was really saying is that it was a white workers' party, but it's really not a white workers' party. Because what's also interesting is that Trump's voters, at least the stats I saw, tended to be people that had more than $100,000. This education criteria is very misleading in terms of its relationship to class. What's critical about understanding the Republican Party is that it is a hard right-wing party that has established itself as essentially a neo-apartheid party. And the message is very, very clear on that. They are a party for the reestablishment of the white republic. They are a party that will concede certain territory for certain peoples of color, much as in apartheid South Africa, where those peoples of color are willing to accept a subordinate status to whites. When you look at the shift of from the Republican to the Democratic Party, it starts in the 1960s after the passage of the 64 and 65 civil rights bills, the 64 Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill of 65. And you see the shift, which happened in advance of the neoliberal shift in the economy. So something started happening. Nixon played into that, understood it with his Southern strategy, which I always lovingly call the white people's strategy. And that's part of what we're up against. So an economic message, and this is where I had disagreements with Sanders, particularly in his first run. An economic message alone is insufficient in a settler state as we are in. It is simply insufficient when race permeates everything, that you can make the strongest economic argument, and that can be trumped, no pun intended, by race. And that's what we've got to deal with. On the other hand, we have the politics of the Democratic Party, which you are clearly identifying, and the dominant factor of that being neoliberalism, which is why we have to carry out a struggle within the Democratic Party, and the Sanders campaign is part of that, was part of that. It carried that out to whatever end it results in. And I don't know what that end's going to be, whether that ends up with a split, whether it ends up driving the neoliberals out or whatever. But that's where that struggle has to happen for a completely different vision. And recognizing when we do that, we have to do it in a way that we draw in more people. Yes, we're going to have differences, but we've got to conceptualize ourselves as the new majority and live it.
Bill, I know you got to run, but
yes,
Bill, thanks for joining us.
Bill, you got to run. I'm sorry, I have somebody. I want to follow up with a question. Do you have 2 minutes or not?
Go for it.
Okay, I just wanted to say, because I love what you're saying about us not being a sect and not being a new majority. But when you say, and I take your point about the white identity politics in the Republican Party very seriously. But when you say economics is not enough, how do you envision building that majority beyond economics? This is an open-ended question. I'm curious about what if the Sanders 2016 strategy wasn't enough, how do we get bigger beyond economics? What's the path for you?
Matt, we have to demonstrate to white workers that it's in their interest to oppose racism. White workers don't believe it. They don't. They don't believe that opposing racism is in their interest. Our job as a left is to demonstrate that it is. And the problem is that when we try, whether you're talking about the populist movement of the 1890s or many movements since, that attempt to skirt race in the name of a super economic, brings everybody together platform, it fails. Because what ends up happening is that the other side, the right, knows full well the power of race, and it inserts it, leading to a split. So we've got to develop a movement that is much more conscious of racial injustice than the movement that we have now, which does not mean simply segmenting movements and having a racial justice movement and an economic justice movement. My argument and my frustration with the Sanders campaign was that the issue of race needed to be not simply an add-on, it needed to be integrated into the platform. Much the way that Jesse Jackson, I would argue, was so successful in his campaign work in '88. Jackson could go and talk to white people, entirely white audiences in the Midwest, and draw the connection between what they were going through and what African Americans, Native Americans, Chicanos, et cetera, were going through. And he did it in a way that reverberated. People got it in their soul. You know, I saw it, I experienced it. And that's what I think was missing from what Sanders was doing and where we have to pick up if we're going to win. And I do believe, as my final point, Bhaskar, we will win. Listen, thank you. I really wish I could stay, but I got to run.
All right.
Y'all take care.
So nice to meet you.
Okay. Pleasure.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay, bye now.
All right, take care. So I think for the rest of you, we'll wrap up in 10 minutes. Give me 10 minutes. Sure. I just have a couple more.
Can I piggyback just on something that?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I just want to say that I could not agree more. And there was this moment that I kept asking for on the campaign. And that was that I wanted Bernie Sanders to give a big race speech. And the plan was for him to give it in Mississippi and to talk about the fact that Mississippi used to be the home to the most millionaires in America because of the roots of, it being a nexus for the slave trade. And to tie in the economic argument to a racial justice argument in that way and talk about how America's original wealth was gotten through these extractive means, and talk about that's the original American corporation and how money that flowed from there was the founding resource for all of these corporations that exist today. And to really build that kind of a rhetoric into his economic justice message. Because it always struck me to be obvious that Black people already have a earned distrust of the establishment, of the man, or whatever you want to call it. But for some reason, that wasn't connecting with this idea of like a socialist, economic, Marxist, whatever argument. But it was it would be conceivably very easy to close that gap. And it was scheduled, and then a heart attack happened, and it never really quite got back on the schedule again. But I believe that there are lots of folks who are able to talk to white people in a way about race in a way that's not alienating. But there are a lot of people who control our racial discourse right now who don't care if it's alienating or not, because their goal is not to actually persuade or convince or connect to white people and work them through racism. It's kind of to point out racism, to call it out, as though the act of calling it out and describing it is going to do anything to move people away from their racial prejudices. And there's a lot of like, it's not my job to talk to racists. It's not my, and I understand that on an individual emotional level. Like, no, if, you know, I'm not asking you to do anything. It's hard and it sucks. And please go live your best life, self-care, all that. But in terms of this project that we're all supposed to be caring about, you know, I know it inures to my benefit if I can convince someone to stop being racist because I'm Black. So I do think that we need to have more confidence in interlocutors like Jesse Jackson, like others, who can have these kinds of conversations that actually advance the cause without alienating people because you're just going in and saying you're racist. Sure, they're racist. It might be true, but we have to think about what our goals are when we're entering into these kinds of conversations.
And Jackson did come through with the Bernie endorsement.
He did.
Not forget, a little late, but
a little late. Better late than never.
but okay, but I want to actually push back. I mean, I feel bad because Bill had to go. Pushing back on this point, but to me, it is true that Bernie struggled among particularly older Black voters. That's without a doubt. It is, the evidence does not suggest to me that him talking about race more would have helped them at all with these.
I agree with that too, though.
Because, because in other words, like people just see the correlation. They see like doing bad among demographic of older Black and brown voters. They must be concerned with the race because race is the difference. But the thing is, these are just Democratic Party stalwarts. You know, they are people who have gained something through Democratic Party networks. The Democratic Party actually has done some things to attempt to represent them, or at least at a symbolic level. And they stand to lose the most if right-wing Republicans or people like Trump are in power and they know the stakes. So it would seem to imagine that Sanders' big play to just talk about electability all the time was actually the best play potentially to win over these voters, because in the end, they became more comfortable with Sanders than they would have otherwise, but they ended up still voting for Biden by and large. But they certainly like Sanders better than like Warren and Julian Castro, who just talked about race all the time and kind of admittedly in like ham-fisted, you know.
I agree. Look, the Demos research said that the lingo, the rhetoric to use is, you know, the powers that be, corporations, whatever, wants to divide us up and keep us fighting amongst ourselves because of race. But if we all stand together and rally together, we can defeat the 1%. I mean, and we all heard Bernie say some version of that a lot, and it works. I think that that's about as far as you can go. And I'm not one of these people who buys into that argument that, oh, Bernie talked too much about woke race stuff this time around, and that's why he lost. I do think there's some truth to the idea that he should have talked more about the economic message and in particular, like the corruption message that was a lot more present in 2016. But those things aren't mutually exclusive. So there's no need for a trade-off there. I think that the campaign should have it did almost no messaging to older voters. Did you ever see a Social Security ad?
Yeah. And there was just those very aborted rollouts, like where, you know, I don't even want to get into that
was a thing.
But yeah,
we didn't need to win every older Black voter, but we need to do better with older voters as a whole. And so that was, so you're right. A lot of these things are tangled up with each other, but I do think on the longer run, part of having a more solid racial message and getting, you know, doing a big race speech, for instance, was a media play. Because there are a lot of Jason Johnsons and Joyanne Reeds on TV that love to exploit the idea that Bernie Sanders wasn't good on race, in quotation marks, to justify to the Warren Democrats why they were right to not support him. And she was an off-ramp to people who were just looking for an excuse not to support Bernie Sanders because somehow she represented a more diverse constituency. I don't know how she got, I don't know.
We're going to avoid the obvious joke here.
But Briahna, I hear you. I think that speech would have been great. It would have been great, you know, for my own, you know, that Mississippi speech would have been perfect for him to go after Jeff Davis. You know, this is where I live. But, and it could have killed. But yeah, I mean, come on, you know those people better than anyone. There's no way they would have given him credit for that, right? I mean, you really think?
It's not about getting Jason Johnson to say the words Bernie Sanders is good. It's about making him feel more exposed when next time he goes on TV and tells the lie, and the viewers begin to perceive a gap between reality and what he's the same way that like when he went on his whole thing about how Bloomberg's not an oligarch. I don't expect him to capitulate and be like, oh yes, actually Bloomberg, it's very bad. Oh, brain spark, the ninth richest man in the world is in fact an oligarch. But when they have these moments, or the body language expert, occasionally what they do is so insane and out of touch with reality that it breaks through to the viewer, right? It breaks through the fourth wall.
Excuse me, that's Dr. Jason Johnson.
All right. Yeah, I mean, but can I get in on this? Because I would also feel bad that Bill left, because I'd love to engage him in dialogue about this. But I guess I feel like what we're talking about here in the last 10, 15 minutes has been in some ways the kind of, it's a sort of the contradiction of primary and general election politics and the dilemma of the left in both of these different hoops. And I don't think that there is it's not clear to me that there is a simple solution, because on the one hand, as Bill has, was saying all hour long, we need to grow this movement beyond a sect. But at the same time, clearly the Sanders movement has, did struggle with black voters, and that shouldn't be trivialized. But the idea that a
caveat: older black voters, and also Bernie Sanders was number 2 with black voters the entire race, and then
right. But Briahna, we know this is bigger than Bernie. This is, yes. If we, I put up a list in my Jacobin piece, but it's, every anti-establishment candidates, black and white, have struggled against establishment candidates, black and white, from Cynthia Nixon in New York, to Vincent Ford in Atlanta, to Chuy Garcia in Chicago. Black voters have, no matter the race of the candidate, no matter how woke or unwoke they were.
Obama until he won Iowa.
How woke? Yes, exactly. How woke and unwoke. So this is an issue. But what I'm saying is, even for and I think you're right. I mean, the media incentives, better than anyone, frankly. So I defer to you on that, especially in the Democratic primary environment. But the problem is, this is where we are in a bit of a paradox, because the things that play to expose Jason Johnson, say, in the manner that you're speaking of, I actually don't think that they're necessarily the same things that get us to 52 or to 6 or really to 60% nationally. And so I don't know if there's a cart horse problem here, but I think in effect, basically like explicating racial capitalism, which has some is an interesting subject to debate and has some value and can be utilized to expose the hypocrisy and the uselessness of corporate Democrats. Yes, especially to their black constituents. Yes, but is that analysis? And this is where I wanted more from Bill. But does that analysis, which might win media points in the kind of increasingly insular and closed ecosystem of the liberal or liberal left media, does that actually advance the ball in terms of associating, breaking the white identity politics of the Republican Party, advancing the sort of the cause of popular and populist policies in the heartland with non-black voters? Does that, I won't even just say white voters, frankly, after this election, with Latino voters, with Asian voters, et cetera, does that, I do think there is some tension, and you're right. I mean, you got to it earlier. There, it's not that it's impossible to sort of hopscotch this, but it does, to sort of find the rhetoric that integrates, some of these realities, and yet doesn't sort of end up being, a scolding device. And I know that's not what Bill wants either. But
it takes.
It's complicated though. Yeah.
It seemed that the red flags, the landmines that you have to avoid to make someone not feel alienated or attacked are pretty. I think we all pretty much know what they are, right? Like I tweeted something today about how Republicans did this, and someone responded to me saying, well, I'm a Republican who would have voted for Bernie. Why are you trying to alienate me? And at first I was mad, and then I remembered, you know what? I normally am not this sloppy. I should have said Republican leadership, the same way I'm always very careful to say Democratic leadership, corporate Democratic leadership, because every little bit counts. When you're really trying to do this stuff at a massive level, you have to be careful. But to your main point, so part of what's happening, part of what you're appealing to is not just the fully bad faith actors like the MSNBC pundits. There's another class of people who really made up the bulk of Warren's support and really helped her with her media narrative. And that's this like intellectual academic class, the people who are writing all the books, the people who are the guests on all of these shows. And to them, they aren't ideologically committed to being anti-Sanders in quite the same way. There are people like, let's say, activist leader, people like Rashad Robinson and let's say Bree Newsom and Black Lives Matter leaders who aren't so captured, but they need to feel like a candidate is genuinely committed to social justice issues before they'll throw their lot in with them or give them favorable coverage or a press, show up at their event, etc.
What if the rhetoric that it takes to win over these people, and this is actually a what if, because this is a big claim that I'm not prepared to substantiate, but what if the rhetoric it takes to win them over is the rhetoric that might turn off older Black voters?
But the argument is not you choose the rhetoric to make Kendi X whatever like Bernie Sanders. It's make Bernie Sanders say enough that he is insulated against the claims that they are making. Because let me tell you, there were Bernie had more kind of like core Black intellectuals supporting his campaign than anybody else, right? The media don't want to talk about that, but your Cornel West and your Barbara Smiths and your Barbara Ransby's, this is who Bernie's camp was. Keeanga Yamada Taylor. But those people, and I'm not naming anybody in particular, had their concerns about Bernie's rhetoric. And it would have been easier for them to defend Bernie and me as a spokesperson if he had been a little bit more adept at speaking the lingo. I need a candidate who can go into a room with movement actors and yes, know how to say intersectionality and all that behind closed doors if that's what's necessary. I'm sorry,
sure. No, I completely believe that Bernie should lie to people to win votes. Honestly, I think machine politics is the classic way. No, so honestly, I would gladly
be dishonest. I know what intersectionality means. But intersectionality discourse. I also have intersectionality discourse.
What about Bhaskar's point though about the other effects of activist language?
I think Bree was talking about public versus private. So for example, the Working Families Party stuff, for example, like maybe Bernie could have did more behind closed doors.
Yes, it's code switching.
Whatever.
I'm not talking about being dishonest or misrepresenting yourself. I'm talking about code switching. I love Bernie. He could have said what he wanted to say at She the People. I don't think what he said was that bad, but She the People didn't need to happen. I'm not going to sit here and say, no, Bernie should not have changed a single thing. Bernie arguably should have known, and I mean this with all the greatest respect. It's not fair, I don't think, but I understand why it happens. That when Bernie walks into a room and is asked a pointed question about racial justice and answers with about how he marched with Dr. King, it feels like he is shirking the question. And at this point, he should understand that and understand the reasons why. And if he continues to go into rooms full of Black people and do that, then at a certain point, the pushback is earned. It's an avoidable mistake.
Yeah, you could understand, but he's in a room where someone's shouting, "You don't get the Black community," and he knows that he has hundreds of thousands of Black supporters, whereas this person doesn't represent a real constituency.
Does he want to be president or not? Life isn't fair. Life isn't fair.
Briahna, I look at it a little more philosophically. Like Bernie had incredible strengths, but he had the defects of those strengths. And one of them was that he's just not a code switcher. And maybe that means he's not going to be president. I mean, it doesn't look like it right now. The electors have not met.
Right. Look, but Biden isn't a code switcher either. But Biden isn't a code switcher either. But Biden didn't go to She the People. Biden didn't go to any of those events. And at the time, it felt like, wow, he's going to get in trouble. But the media never criticized him for it. Remember, Bernie skipped a human rights, like an LGBTQ event, and the media treated it like he had personally hate crimed, RuPaul. Like they just treated it like he was like the most hateful person on the planet. And yet Biden skipped all these events. Nobody really cared. And he was smart to do so because we all know what he sounds like unfiltered. We all just listened to that leaked tape and he's out of control. Biracial commercials on TV. All the biracials are going to fix America. It's nuts.
Can you imagine if Bernie had a corn pop moment? Can you imagine that corn pop story coming out of Bernie's?
Oh my God! And all the little Black kids like to play with my blonde light hair. I mean, give me a break. That would have been disqualifying. Okay, so my point is, between us when we're sitting around yakking, oh yes, everything was unfair and Bernie got shafted and let's have a beer and toast to it someday. But if we're gonna be if this is a little bit of an accountability session, part of me has a lot of hope for folks like, she's in the hot seat right now, but the AOCs and Ilhans and Rashidas of the world, because at the end of the day, they are good at that.
Okay, but hold on a second. Matt, let me just jump in, because I think though, this whole story just makes me think that Biden was right, though. That Biden was right just to ignore this whole activist track of the party and to focus on his core message and his core constituency. Then he won. I'm not saying Bernie would have won if he did something else, but I have just think that our lesson from this should be that these people don't matter that much and that we could go the Biden route. Obviously, very different policies.
I think some of that is true, but let's not forget that Biden came in 4th or 5th in the first 2 states. 4th or 5th, and then managed to squeak out a 2nd place victory in Nevada, but he was like 20 points behind Bernie. And then the establishment stepped in and saved it for him, right? South Carolina, obviously, and then the establishment stepped in and saved it for him. So I don't know what would happen to Biden in a world where Barack Obama didn't make a bunch of calls and gently encourage the election in his favor. I don't think. But let me agree with you, though. Let me agree with you. Like I said, but he was right to skip those events. If I would have told Bernie, don't go to She the People, I would have turned, after that first View appearance, if anybody on the campaign ever listened to a single thing that I said, because I really was not in a senior position and I was not giving there in any advisory capacity whatsoever. But if I were, I would have said, never go on The View again. What's the point? What's her name? Whoopi Goldberg has a virulent, deep-seated hatred for you, and also is deeply ignorant of what's going on planet Earth. And there's no neat reason for you to expose yourself to that at all. I don't mean that as an attack, like ignorant, like she literally didn't know what was going on. She had Bernie Sanders come on The View and asked him if he had ever heard of this idea about the 91%, 99% versus the 1%, because she had just talked to Andrew Yang about it. And Andrew Yang had some pretty interesting ideas about wealth inequality in this country.
Very disappointing stuff from Guinan. It was heartbreaking. It was not like one of those late night on the bridge, trying to give Picard the little wisdom that he needs.
And 10 forward.
It was very far from 10 forward. Yeah, but I lost it with my Star Trek. But Bhaskar, to your point, yeah, I mean, look, I agree with you on this. I think I want a communist Biden, more than I want a kind of a more deft Bernie. But in terms of like the style, and I see how that's more powerful. But we don't have that luxury. Is the hard part with the left, is that we have to do hopscotch. We don't have the media behind us. We don't have the establishment behind us. We don't have the so we have to figure out how to play ball in some way, even if it's just at the tactical level, with these existing subgroups, until Bernie was in some ways our best chance to go above and beyond it. But the AOCs, et cetera, have to play ball even more. And the ones that are coming up through, unless we can build.
Well, I think play ball with the patronage networks that matter. Play ball with the Black clergy. Play ball with professional associations. Don't play ball with academics.
Yeah, but they want that too.
With journalists.
But Bhaskar, that's the thing that, like, I'm sorry, like, if I can just be Black here for a second in a space where, I love the left. I never left Punch. But if we were having some come to Jesus moments here about some vulnerabilities among some of these left spaces that don't always have a lot of Black representation, like, if you go to a Black professional organization, there is a certain kind of lingo about Black enterprise and putting money into the community and allowing people to start small businesses that is very antithetical to the way we talk about the left and how our path to freedom is not through a bunch of small business association grants, right? But you can't go into a space like that in Cleveland, Ohio, and sit down with a small business, whoever it is there, and be dismissive of the idea of like a Black bank. You cannot do it. You are not going to win that way. Maybe 20, 30 years from now, we're working in these communities, we're doing we can bring people around to our side, but you can't be dismissive of those ideas. You can't be dismissive of reparations. You have to know how to talk in the room and validate the lingo, the approach to equality that people believe is how they're going to get out of suffering, whether or not you necessarily agree. And if anything, if you're going to compromise on anything,
It shouldn't be on your values or courting Republicans or whatnot. It should be understanding that there are these historical traditions that you need to be respectful of and show that you're familiar with if you're going to get people to buy into your movement.
I completely agree when it comes to the language of even Black entrepreneurship and things like that. That's, I think, a different constituency. Because, for instance, in a capitalist economy, it actually does there's actually a lot of logic to the idea that entrepreneurship and small businesses could have some material benefits. It's like, it's not the real solution that we believe in of like, universal social programs or whatever else, but at least it's more material than, some symbolic thing the Democrats are going to do.
I see you. I hear you. Yeah, I'll build a statue.
Yeah, exactly. At least it's like more material there. But I do think that's a different constituency than the media class, even though there is overlap. But I feel like we should end it with one big, positive thought, which is that, at least in my mind, what both of you brought up early on is that we have a constituency that we didn't have before. Bree, you talked about the constituency of angry, fed up people who want and believe in Medicare for all, believe in having a decent unionized job, believe in all these redistributional stuff that came out of the Sanders campaign. Matt, you mentioned that there is a real layer of elected officials who subscribe to most, if not all, of this program. And yes, we can sometimes be harsh on her, but AOC is a very good example of, I think, someone who's still around to popularize these things, maybe not as effectively as Bernie in certain spheres, but maybe, she's still a young politician. Bernie at age 30 was, I think, back to the land trying to like farm and
unemployed.
He was a carpenter. He was definitely a carpenter.
Weed. I'm sure there was, if not growing it, trying to grow it and having to go into town to buy it. But this is there are causes for hope. So let's wrap up. But I guess we have 3 more minutes left. Give me some hope.
I'm full of hope. I didn't
restarted with hope.
Yes. Let's end with hope too.
I do feel like though that there are people sometimes, and I'm not pointing any fingers. I really am not. But the left so often gets characterized as silly and unserious and like kids playing games in their parents' basement that I think there's a certain almost unwillingness. Sometimes leftists feel like they have to put their serious person hat on and be like really cynical and pragmatic to the point where they uninspire people. And if I go a little over the top with being sunny and optimistic, because I feel like I'm sometimes having to make up for a deficit and an overabundance of cynicism amongst our ranks. So I think the fundamental issue is that Bernie made us believe in ourselves and think that something real change was possible. And a lot of us have felt like that was a deeply naive thing to believe our entire lives. Children believe we can actually close the ozone hole. Children believe that it's you should prioritize the environment and panda bears and stuff. But like Bernie made us think it's okay to go back to that. And I don't want that door to close because we miss 100% of the shots we don't take. That's all I'm saying.
My last note of optimism is it is not yet January 6th. That is when Congress meets to certify the electoral votes. And we have several legal challenges outstanding. There is still alternate slates of electors being developed from California and elsewhere. No, we knew Bernie was a moonshot. I said this when he lost. We knew it. I believed in the moment, but I think some part of me outside my body always knew this was a long shot, that we were not prepared in some, really profound corporeal institutional sense to sort of provide the army that could drive this, movement all the way to victory and then actually govern with it. But we also knew it was so worthwhile to have that fight. And for the exact reasons that Briahna laid out, that gave us, not just us, that gave millions, tens of millions of people the belief that something like this was possible. And I actually do think that the number one enemy within left media spaces right now probably is a kind of doomerism. This is not the number one enemy for the country. That's capitalism. But I think the number one enemy for basically people listening to this podcast or this YouTube is the kind of post Bernie black pill cynicism that really says, okay, oh yeah, those polls show 88% support, but we know it doesn't mean shit because you can't win. And to say that 2020 seals the deal. And I think the more intelligent pessimists out there would recognize that there's a difference between pessimism and doomerism, and I think there's a good case for pessimism, but I don't think we can give way to, in the short term, but I don't think we can give way to doom, because I think we've advanced the ball, as Bhaskar says, over the last 5 years incredibly. And that's not, we don't have a victory parade. We're not at the Connor Kilpatrick end of Star Wars moment where we're all getting our medals. He was envisioning this, Briahna, you'd be sitting there right next to Virgil, getting your medal on the lawn under the big parade at the end of New Hope. Okay, that didn't happen, but maybe 40 years from now that will happen.
Oh my God, that would have been a perfect way to end this if you didn't mention Star Wars, you nerd. But by the way, Brie mentioned Whoopi Goldberg. And my plan for the rest of the evening is watching a 1996 movie called Eddie, one of Whoopi Goldberg's best movies. You should look it up. She becomes the coach of the New York Knicks. There's a big climactic battle at the end where the Charlotte Hornets are somehow the big market baddie that are going to take the Knicks away if they lose this playoff game. But
they were good back then.
Yeah, Grandmama.
Until 95, so I can vouch for that. Look, Whoopi Goldberg is the star of my favorite film of all time. I will always respect her as an actress and comedic talent. That would be The Color Purple, Steven Spielberg's The Color Purple. And I root for her as a human being, just like I root for a lot of the Star Trek actors who have revealed themselves to have not very good politics online. I'm looking at you, Deanna Troy.
We can all be redeemed.
We can all be redeemed.
Major failure of empathy there. Yeah.
All right. Well, take care. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for watching this tribute to Michael Brooks. I'm sure there's going to be more on this channel, so please stay subscribed. Check out Briahna's podcast, read Matt's book, and read Bill Fletcher's book, and subscribe to Jacobin. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.